Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see such a strong turnout on a sunny day in Copenhagen. And there's good reason for such a strong turnout, because what we're discussing today is really the most important geopolitical relationship of our lifetimes, and that's the relationship between the United States and China, and broader and common challenges with sustainability and with technology that both these large countries, but also the rest of us, are facing. And we're often told in the West that we have little choice but to find avenues of cooperation with China, despite the fact that the relationship between the United States and China is becoming definitely more competitive, certainly even adversarial, and China's relationship with the West at large is becoming much more contentious in recent years. At the same time, however, we have these broader issues that affect us all: pandemics, climate change, new technologies, where China, as the second largest economy in the world, as the second largest country in terms of population in the world, as a driver of new technologies in many subsectors, is important to engage. And so to help us understand how we can overcome this challenge of engaging with China on global issues, and to give us a picture of China's advances in sustainability and in technology, we have Dr. Scott Moore visiting us today at DIIS. Dr. Moore is director of the China Programs and Strategic Initiatives at Penn Global at the University of Pennsylvania in the United States. His research focuses on environmental sustainability, technology, and international relations. He served in the State Department, where he worked closely on climate change issues. And he's also the author of this very compelling recent book called China's Next Act, which I urge you all to get your hands on after the talk, and to really dive into, because it really gets into a lot of these crucial issues of the relationship with China, with the US and with the rest of the world. So we're going to begin with a talk from Dr. Moore about his book. We're then going to have a brief Q&A. We'll then have a coffee break. And then we have a second treat for you today, which is that we're going to have a panel that focuses on a particular area of technological competition between China and the United States, and that's the semiconductor industry. And I'll introduce our speakers before that panel after the break. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Moore, and I'll pass the floor on to you.
Thanks very much, Luke. Thanks to DIIS for having me here. Thank you to my co-panelists who will join here later, and thanks to you all. It really is no small thing for you all to be here instead of in the park or somewhere else on this beautiful sunny day. And I can say that because I was fortunate enough to have most of yesterday free, and I spent most of it in the park because it was such a beautiful day. So thank you for being here. So I wrote this book, China's Next Act, because I think that the dilemma that Luke outlined is one of the most important facing us as a global community and international community, namely that almost no major global challenge, whether it's in the sphere of climate change and public health, or even thinking about dealing with the implications of emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology among them, can be adequately addressed without China and without some form of cooperation and engagement with China. On the other hand, it's unrealistic to think that that can be done easily or simply or without trade-offs, because that cooperation, that engagement is on the understanding or in the context of very different, not just institutions, but also very different values when it comes to the nature of these shared challenges, and particularly how the global community should think about the emerging challenges that we face, again, especially in the technological arena. And I should say, maybe by way of some introduction, that I began kind of thinking about all of these issues a decade or so ago when I had the chance to, I'm an academic, but I had the chance to spend some time at the U.S. State Department, as Luke mentioned. And the portfolio that I had while I was there was called Environment, Science, Technology, and Health. And I have to tell you that for someone coming from an academic perspective, I'm sure many of you will appreciate this, being told that you're going to have to cover environment, science, technology, and health seemed somewhere between laughable and downright dangerous. To expect one person to kind of take care of all of those extremely different and highly technical subject areas. But it turned out to be a really important and interesting set of responsibilities to have, daunting as it was, because the period that I was there saw what I think in retrospect was a pretty significant change in China's relationship with the United States and China's role in the world more generally, because it was a period in which China became centrally involved and really indispensable to global governance and the response to shared challenges. And I saw this most acutely in working on the Paris Agreement, where U.S.-China diplomacy was really critical to the eventual conclusion of that agreement and the response to climate change, such as it is, at least to date, but also in public health, where, and this was in the 2015-2016 timeframe, the U.S. and China had just come off of a pretty successful example of cooperation in response to a very serious outbreak of Ebola in West Africa. That was in 2014. 2015. And you saw some scenes at that time which are pretty unimaginable now, but at the time were extremely moving, really, of things like Chinese military units unloading supplies that were landed by American military units and then were used to build field hospitals to treat Ebola patients in Liberia, Gabon, and other places in West Africa. And at the time, this really signaled to me, and I think a lot of my colleagues, that it was not only possible for the United States as well as other countries to cooperate effectively with China on these shared global challenges like climate change, public health, but also that doing so might lay the foundation for a more constructive relationship going forward. Unfortunately, as you all know, that didn't quite pan out. Or at least haven't so far. And that's question one I wanted to answer through this book. Why didn't that happen? Why haven't we seen more effective cooperation, both between the U.S. and China, but also more globally and between China and other countries, even as our shared challenges have only grown more acute? And obviously, we've experienced a devastating global pandemic in the meantime, along with accelerating climate change and other crises almost too numerous to count. So that's question one. But as if that weren't a big enough question on its own, I also wanted to, further away? Okay, sorry. I'm not used to this, you can tell. I feel like I should go on tour maybe with this thing. I guess maybe I am on tour already. But as if that weren't a big enough question, I also wanted to answer a second related one that came out of this experience I had working in government, which was seeing that at the time, we really, in the environment, science, technology, and health, the abbreviation for it is ESTH. The E and the H were the things that we really spent the most time thinking about when it came to China. We really didn't do so much on the S and the T, the science and technology. In the intervening time, though, in the decade or so since that time, those issues have become far more central to the U.S.-China relationship, and I would say China's role in the world more generally, even as we've seen the overall relationship kind of get more competitive and rivalrous. And I would even say that the kind of driving force behind that competition and rivalry, especially between the U.S. and China, that's taken place over the last decade has really been driven by science and technology issues, and especially China's role in developing emerging technologies. So I wanted to try to understand these two kind of forces and try to answer these two questions. One, why cooperation has basically failed. at least so far, between the U.S. and China especially, but more generally China and the rest of the world in response to shared global challenges, but also why we've seen that kind of science and technology emphasis become so much more central to China's role in the world, even again as it's driven a lot of kind of the rivalry and competition that we've seen instead of cooperation. So let me say a little bit about my answers to those questions, and then how I think that kind of points us toward a slightly different understanding and thinking about China's role in the world. So in terms of why cooperation has failed, I pin it really on the influence of three forces, which are deeply rooted in the Chinese political tradition, though none of them are unique to China, and which have formed the basis of China's response to these newer emerging issues, whether it's climate change and decarbonization, pandemics, or indeed emerging technologies. And those three forces are authoritarianism, nationalism, and protectionism. Again, none of those are unique to China, but they are deeply rooted in China's political tradition. And as Beijing has, like governments everywhere, struggled to respond to the threats posed by climate change, pandemics, as well as to try to figure out how to deal with both the risks and opportunities posed by emerging technologies, Beijing has relied, almost rushed to these three familiar but very problematic principles as the basis of policymaking. And just to say a little bit more about that, authoritarianism, the influence of that is especially evident in China's technology policies, especially when it comes to the use of newer technologies being embedded in systems for surveillance or information control or things like that. But it's also evident to some degree in China's policy with respect to climate change and energy. An interesting aspect of China's climate policy is that it's very personalized by Xi Jinping. China's signature climate change policy is, as many of you may know, a commitment to reach net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2060. This was a commitment that Xi Jinping made personally in a remote address before the UN General Assembly, a very high profile, very high visibility kind of event. And since then, Xi has identified himself very closely with China's climate and energy policy targets in a way that really hasn't been equaled in any other policy area except perhaps zero COVID. Hopefully, China's climate policy will turn out a little better than that one, and I do think it will. But Xi has really personalized that. And that actually creates an interesting set of implications because on the one hand, it actually gives some credibility to China's climate target that Xi Jinping is personally kind of committed to making it happen. But on the other hand, it means that the implementation of that policy depends very heavily on top-down centralized control. And in fact, a lot of the tensions and difficulties that China has experienced in terms of moving toward decarbonization have been an extension of that, where officials at local and lower levels, as well as in different kind of parts of the government that are charged with things like ensuring energy security, have felt that their missions and objectives are compromised by this high-level policy commitment, which has led to quite a bit of dissension and contradiction in terms of how fast and how resolutely China has moved toward its decarbonization targets. Even though, and we can come back to this in question and answer, I am pretty confident that China will meet its 2060 target, perhaps with plus minus 5 years, kind of a thing. The question, and again we can come back to this, is how net will China's emissions be in 2060? In other words, how much carbon will China be continuing to emit that either has to be sequestered underground or offset in some way? So that question of how net is crucial. But I think basically the target by 2060 will be met. Okay, so authoritarianism. Number two, nationalism. So this is one, nationalism, again, common phenomenon across many different countries. Chinese nationalism is a little different in that since 1989 in particular, it's been deliberately constructed by the Chinese Communist Party as part of a ruling strategy. And that means that Chinese nationalism kind of combines popular sentiment with a very strong kind of degree of state direction or influence. And that is problematic insofar as it's been adopted by a number of commentators to create narratives around issues like climate change, but the best example is the COVID-19 pandemic that have the effect of discouraging international cooperation. So many of you may have heard about this, but the most famous kind of example, COVID-era example of a sort of extreme nationalist conspiracy theory to arise within China is the idea that it was actually a U.S.-designed bioweapon, that COVID-19 was a U.S.-designed bioweapon. That was created explicitly to sort of keep China down. This is probably the point at which I should also acknowledge that even though I make a lot of these of authoritarianism, nationalism, and protectionism with respect to China in the book, again, these influences are hardly limited to China. And in fact, I think part of the broader story of why global cooperation has not been nearly as effective or widespread as we would wish with respect to the pandemic as well as climate change is that these influences have also become more prominent in other countries, including the U.S. And other major countries as well. And indeed, there is a not totally trivial American conspiracy theory around China around COVID-19 being a deliberately engineered Chinese, kind of origin virus. We can again get into COVID origins if you're interested, but suffice it to say, these narratives, these kind of ideas, are really harmful to global and international cooperation. Last force, which I think is in many ways the most problematic, is protectionism. And this I mean in economic terms, economic protectionism. And there are a couple of areas in which I think the influence of protectionism has been especially harmful to a cooperative global response to shared challenges, whether it's ecological or technological. And the first of those areas is in emerging technology. A characteristic, actually, of China's tech policy, particularly with respect to things like data, but increasingly also artificial intelligence, is to really treat, and again, data may be the best example, as effectively a strategic national resource. And China has put in place a number of provisions which actually, some of them have arguably positive aspects related to strengthening controls on data privacy, for example, but they have the effect of making it very difficult for foreign firms as well as universities and research institutions to gather, access, and then export data gathered within China. As we look down the road toward trying to maximize the opportunities created by the rise of artificial intelligence and things like that, that sort of protectionist data policies, protectionist tech policies are really problematic. The second major example, which is I think even kind of clearer and more concrete, is in clean energy. And that case is quite clear insofar as China's manufacturing economies of scale in virtually every clean technology, including solar panels, wind power, are just unparalleled. And if your goal is to maximize the spread of these technologies as quickly and cheaply as possible around the world, there is really no alternative to utilizing and maximizing China's economies of scale in that space. What's not particularly helpful if you're trying to achieve that goal using China's manufacturing economies of scale are to adopt protectionist economic policies, impose tariffs on Chinese solar panels and other things. And yet that's exactly what many major economies have done, including the U.S. under the Trump administration, for example. However, and this gets me to the second part of the talk in terms of what does this mean and what do we do about it. There is some evidence that, or some, I think, reason to believe that we might not need to depend entirely on cooperation to respond to some of these shared global challenges. And that's a good thing because, as I just mentioned, with the influence of these three forces, that hasn't turned out so well so far. And in fact, competition, whether it's economic, geopolitical, ideological, might be good in at least a couple of ways. And again, clean energy, clean technology is one example of that, insofar as the major U.S. investment so far in clean energy deployment is the Inflation Reduction Act. And what's interesting to me about that is that in his message to Congress saying, essentially, if you pass this bill, I will sign it, President Biden talked mostly about China. He did talk a little about green jobs. He talked a little about climate change itself, but he talked mostly about the need for this legislation to equip the United States to respond effectively, compete effectively with China. I hasten to say that I don't think that competition with China is the best or only reason to invest in clean energy, but if it gets us a 44% reduction in U.S. emissions, I'll take it. And I think that's something worth considering. The related point that occurs to me about the role of cooperation versus competition in something like clean energy, clean technology, is that if we're really planning to get to essentially net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the end of the century, which arguably we need to get there much sooner, but that's probably something approaching a realistic time horizon, we probably need at least one new generation of clean technology that we don't presently have at commercial scale. So with solar, for example, we might not be using the polysilicon solar cells that we presently use commercially. We might use something called perovskites or other exotic, more exotic materials. If we do that, if we're looking to a new generation or two of clean technology, we might not need to depend quite so much on China's manufacturing economies of scale. We might instead need to prioritize a lot of research and development on that next generation of clean technology. And that's where the idea of competition with China can, I think, be helpful insofar as it generates the political support for investment in clean energy, clean technology, research and development. And I have to say, I mean, I think the major case in which we've seen this so far has been in the U.S., but it's my impression, and I'd be interested to hear from those of you here, that Europe is moving kind of more in a similar direction in terms of seeing investments, at least in clean energy, clean technology, at least in part motivated by competitive dynamics, or sort of with the idea of some type of economic or geopolitical competition in mind. A few other things which I'll just point to as things I think we need to think more about and do more of to kind of navigate this dilemma where we need engagement with China and at the same time can't necessarily depend on cooperation with it to address shared global challenges. One implication, I think, is that we need to think very broadly about what engagement with China means. Typically, at least in the U.S., when people talk about U.S.-China cooperation, they refer mainly to cooperation between the two countries' governments. It's through diplomacy or some type of formal government-to-government relationship. And I think we have to think much more deliberately and intentionally about cooperation across the rest of society and engagement across the rest of society, whether it's universities, research institutions, even industry associations. Now, granted, or sectoral groups in different businesses and industries. Now, granted, in the case of China, there is a much closer relationship between the government and the state and those kinds of entities than there is in most Western countries, but nonetheless, many of them have at least partial autonomy from the state and from the government apparatus. And I think those types of relationships, thinking beyond just national governments, is particularly important in thinking about the nature of these shared global challenges in environment, health, technology. In the case of something like climate change, for example, you really need to transform an entire economy. Obviously, in that context, the private sector, industry, sectoral groups play a really important role. You can't just rely on governments. When it comes to emerging technologies, on the other hand, you sort of have an interesting shared dilemma between that's common both to Beijing, Washington, Brussels, Copenhagen, which is that the technology is advancing much faster than governments can possibly regulate. And that means that if you're thinking about an issue like gene editing or synthetic biology, the de facto regulators are often individual biotech startups or even individual researchers who are using the technology. And so again, that strengthens, I think, the need for us to think about engagement, cooperation, not just between governments, but between the rest of society as well. A final thing I'll just say, and then happy to be joined by my co-panelists here, and then we'll have some discussion, is just that I also think, and I say this particularly with an American perspective in mind, when it comes to China and addressing shared global challenges, you really need to think about that as a multilateral problem. The U.S. and China are two big, powerful countries. For something like climate change, you put them together and they're about half of global emissions. And yet even that type of scale won't get us to solving the problem by themselves. And you can replicate that across all of these different issues that I've talked about. If you put the U.S. and China together, you have a big fraction of the global biotech sector, for example, big fraction of the global artificial intelligence research community. And yet the nature of these challenges means that even if, and this is obviously not the world that we live in, even if the U.S. and China were aligned on those issues, that still wouldn't be sufficient to address these challenges at a global scale. And so any type of engagement or cooperation that does happen has to be multilateral, and it has to be beyond just the U.S. and China. I'm going to maybe stop there, and then we can have some further discussion. But thank you all very much again.
So I thought now we could take some Q&A
Sorry.
for Scott's presentation. Lot to tackle there. A lot of issues Scott's raised on the bilateral relationship, but also in specific issues. I saw a gentleman right here. If you can just wait for the microphone from Niels here, and please just say your name and any affiliation you might have.
My name is Carsten Boyer-Thøgersen. I'm former diplomat in China with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much, Scott Moore, for your presentation. I've been looking forward to hear what you said, and I'm also been looking forward to read your book. But just one comment, and I have one comment to your presentation, and then maybe I would like to hear your comment to that. I think I agree with you that these years, China, as China is today, is an enormous challenge to Europe and United States. But I think for other reasons that you mentioned. I think the challenge is because of China's landmass, population, size of population, economy, history, administrative experience through history and dynasties, not because of China's political system. And this is where you mentioned that why is there no cooperation? It is because of China's political system. And then you mentioned value-based observations, which arrives from the present American narrative about China. China is repressive inwards and aggressive outwards. And I think if we, in the Western world, in Europe, if we have to stand up and find our ways vis-a-vis a rising power like China, because of the reasons which I mentioned, then I think it is not helpful for our situation if we use a very value-based analysis of China. You could likewise say, people said that 100 years ago, Chinese, they are not Christian people, they don't believe in God. It doesn't work. I think we have to think deeply how we can make sure that we get the best out of this situation. And also, very interestingly, one of the conflicts now is this conflict between United States and China. And you didn't mention, as neither mentioned, that what are the American policies, what are the results of the American containment policies, and there are really, really many. And this is not this is a one-sided and not helpful way to secure our own societies in Europe. So this is my observation. I would like to, if you have a comment.
Thanks very much. Do we have another question we can take? I see Jørn there.
Yes, Jørn Dellman, Professor Emeritus of China Studies. So I was wondering, when you were saying that you're working for the administration, the US, that you have this ESTH portfolio, but you mainly worked on E and H, not on S and T. Was that correctly understood? Yeah. I was just wondering why that happened, because there's been a strong tradition in the US and also in Europe of science technology studies relating to China. So I don't think that it was any secret what China wanted to do, where they were heading, what were their ambitions. So I'm just wondering, why was it downplayed? Why didn't the US realize it? And why was it not taken into account in American policies? All the time when you had companies, you had universities working very, very closely with Chinese partners over the years. And another observation is about Xi Jinping and climate change politics. I think we have to go further back. I think, obviously, it's always been a top-down policy, but I don't think he's personalized it in that way. I think he's just giving the big talk, right? But if you look specifically at how Chinese climate politics have developed, it has been happening for the last 20 years. The policy tools that have been developed at central level, local level. There's been a lot of dynamic in this. So you could say Xi Jinping is more capitalizing on what has happened in China than really putting himself at the center in that way. Although it's also been documented, I would recognize that he has always been green in his approach to development, right from when he was a low-level official at the county level. But still, I think the Chinese climate policies have been developed in many different quarters of China. There's been a lot of experimentation. It's not only top-down, it's also market-based, it's also cooperative governance. So I think trying to pinpoint the whole thing on Xi Jinping is not correct. Thank you.
Thank you for two really good questions and comments. With respect to the first, in terms of the kind of limits of a values-based analysis, I take the point, and it's interesting for me. I hope I sort of concede this readily enough in the preface. I mean, I don't claim for this to be a totally unbiased account, and that I try to be quite upfront that I'm thinking about China largely from an American perspective, and certainly I channel, I think, a lot of the American policy community's concern with respect to the implications of China's involvement, whether it's in technology or in climate or other areas. What I would maybe say is that I think, and again, I appreciate that there's a strong argument for pragmatism in other country contexts, but I think the reality is that the global response to whether it's to emerging technologies or climate or anything else do have very, very strong value-based dimensions. And I think if we don't take that into account, that risks harming the liberal world order as well as impeding the response to the actual challenges themselves. And so again, I think actually the kind of economic sphere is the one that I would point to as perhaps the most concerning with respect to climate change. I mean, even though I think we may be able to make some progress toward research and development of clean technology through kind of competition, so to speak, ultimately we need to deploy this stuff everywhere. And that is a task that is not going to be aided by protectionist economic policies. It's going to make it more expensive and more difficult. And so I am concerned about that, that kind of the injection of sort of protectionist values, so to speak, into policy that pertains to clean energy, among other things. I think, let's see, the results of a U.S. Sort of containment policy, actually, maybe I'll come back to that in a second, because I think the sort of science and technology issues question is relevant to mention first. Basically, the time frame here is really important. So I was working on these issues in 2015 to 2016. This was prior to the Made in China 2025 strategy, which in the U.S. was really the trigger for being alarmed about China's investments in science and technology and innovation, even though, as you rightly point out, and I mean, Douglas has written very extensively about that. I mean, science and technology has been a priority throughout the entire reform era. So there was nothing, particularly new about this, but for several reasons, it sort of jumped on the radar at this point. All I can say is that at the time, there was I think a perception that there was enough of a gap in most science and technology areas that it just wasn't as much of a priority for diplomacy as compared to issues like climate change, which were just very high on the Obama administration's priority list. Personalization of climate policy. So I think what I would maybe take a little bit of issue in there is prior to the 2060 target, which Xi announced at the 2020 UN General Assembly, which was held virtually due to the pandemic, China had not actually committed to reducing its emissions. And obviously, from a global standpoint, that's all that matters. The previous policy commitments that China had made were things like increasing the share of non-fossil energy, improving carbon intensity, energy efficiency, all of which are important, but ultimately you need to reduce emissions. And so that was a real kind of landmark change in China's climate policy. And it's certainly true that kind of builds on an architecture of policy that had been outlaid before. A lot of the implementation was then through 5-year plan targets, which relied, again, largely on things like share of non-fossil energy. But the promulgation of that target itself was new, and that really was Xi Jinping. I mean, no one else could have articulated that policy. It was somewhat of a surprise that it was promulgated in that fashion, and he's remained very active, I guess you could say, in the climate policy arena. It is worth pointing out, and you mentioned this, Xi actually does have fairly strong green credentials, which I think is worth noting. I mean, he has enough of a track record. He's, for example, wrote a letter to university students in which he talked about being a young man and being very struck by some of the agriculture. He used to work a lot on agriculture and being struck by how some of the agricultural policies that China had really kind of stripped the land bare and things like that of nutrients. And so he actually does sort of seem to have an environmental sensibility and mentality. I didn't. I'm sorry. Address the U.S. containment policy, and maybe I could just ask you to clarify that point or what you were looking for there. Sorry.
You are asking what I mean by the U.S. containment of China.
Yeah. You were.
I'm thinking about the laws. Numbers of Congress have passed so many laws over the last 4 or 5 years, and there is something called AUKUS and the alliances and so on. I think I don't have to explain that further.
Okay.
I suppose you know all the examples.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, well, listen. I think and I my kind of view of China policy is, I think, basically, maybe not surprisingly, basically the Obama administration era view of China policy, which is that China does present some serious challenges and threats in kind of certain areas, but there's kind of need for a lot of nuance in that policy, taking recognition of the fact that China has such an important role to play in shared global challenges. And here's the thing I think that has really been lost in the current U.S. policy discussion. China is not really a peer. It is, it again presents some serious challenges and threats. But I think in the U.S., China has become like this. People think it's sort of going to surpass the U.S. There's almost no meaningful sense in which that is likely in the foreseeable future. And I think that sense of kind of perspective and balance in terms of how aggressively you construct a response to China has been lost. And so I think I would my response to your question about containment is, I do think there is the U.S. policy direction with China has been overly aggressive to the point where I think it actually is more harmful than helpful in a number of respects. And one that occurs to me, and again, not to harp too much on the sort of protectionist point, but I think the emphasis that the U.S. has placed on scrutinizing investment and controlling the export of key technologies to China really threatens not just U.S. Economic competitiveness in some key areas, but also its relationship with key allies.
Any other questions before we go to break? If there's one or two more, I see one in the back corner there, up here.
Hi, Philip, engaged citizen. You use the shorthand global community, and then you turn to talk about two situations where it was more of an ad hoc bilateral thing, the Ebola response and the Paris Climate Agreement. It seems like the US likes to talk about a global community, but seems to resist building up multilateral institutions sometimes. Do you think that there is a internal State Department limitation to how to engage with China? And do you think that this has cooled off China's willingness to engage? Or is the flexibility of an ad hoc bilateral cooperation better suited for the 21st century?
Yeah, and if I could ask, what is global citizen, just out of curiosity?
No, engaged citizen.
Engaged citizen, I'm sorry, engaged citizen.
I'm a nurse.
Okay, gotcha. No, I'm sorry, I thought it was maybe an organization or something. You are an engaged citizen. Well, excellent. That is the way to be. So I think that there's no, okay. Basically, the reason why I think the U.S. and China have gravitated towards these bilateral forms of negotiation is basically narcissism. It's there's, I think, a lot of like appeal to the idea that you have these two big, strong, powerful countries, and if they can sort of save the world, together, kind of a thing. I think it really sort of boils down to that. It is also easier. It's a lot easier to get 2 parties in a room than 12, and there are many fewer transaction costs to that. And I would also say politically, there's for a government like China, they like the optics of having a state visit to Washington where, Xi Jinping can meet with President Obama and they, announce a major climate kind of agreement. There's a lot of kind of political and optical appeal to something like that, which is just not as easy to achieve if you have a meeting of 12 heads of state. It's a different kind of political dynamic. So I think it basically has to do more with symbolism and politics than anything kind of more systemic. Now, I will say, there definitely is a strain of thought in the U.S. That's sort of antagonistic to multilateral organizations. I think that's ebbed a little bit over the last few years, but it's definitely still present. In other words, a lot of skepticism, particularly of the UN and UN agencies, which has a lot of, there are a lot of reasons for that. The other concern, which I heard as recently as this morning, is that China actually is quite good at manipulating multilateral organizations to further kind of its own objectives and dilute the voice of other participants in those settings. So there are some, practical limitations to utilizing kind of multilateral organizations. But I think, and this is the final thing I'll say, I actually think the U.S. has been notably bad about how they've approached multilateral organizations, and I do think that the nature of these shared challenges means that they have to get much better at utilizing them and engaging them.
Great. We have just 2 quick questions in the front. Gentleman here in the white shirt, and then, okay. We can save that for after maybe. Just one more question, and then we'll get to break. Thanks very much.
Hello, thank you. So my name is Jesper Mortensen. I have no particular affiliation, just saw the meeting here and thought it was interesting.
Great.
So my question is, and you haven't mentioned the word Taiwan. So I think all of these discussions are interesting, but if we have a full-scale blockade or invasion, a lot of what you're talking about is probably out the window.
True.
So what is, of course, you're not a fortune teller, but what is the probability of actually a real blockade or invasion of Taiwan? And do you think actually the U.S. would intervene?
Yeah.
That was a shorter question. I'm not an academic.
Yeah, and I'll invite actually Douglas too to give his, because I think this is the type of question where if you ask 10 different people, you probably are going to get 10 different, you may get 12 different answers or 15 different answers if you ask 10 people. But mine would be not likely. And in terms of a, sort of kinetic action, at least in the near term. And I don't know. I honestly don't know what the U.S. response would be. To say a few more words about both of those things, my view is that while I think there is a lot of appeal to Xi in particular to kind of fundamentally alter Taiwan's relationship with the mainland before he leaves power, and if you're interested, I could say more about why I think that. I think there is a strong kind of appeal for Xi to do that. I think the risks and practical challenges to trying to achieve that goal through force are sufficiently high that he will not take kinetic action unless Taiwan declares independence, which it will not do in the foreseeable future. You never say never, but it won't do in the foreseeable future. So that's my view. I would also add, though, that I think the interesting thing about a Taiwan conflict scenario is that depending on when it might take place, so if you're talking, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, there are a lot of ways in which conflict could look very, very different from what it means today and what we're used to thinking about. For example, a lot of it, conceivably even all of it, could take place between unmanned systems. And that presents a lot of very interesting implications. If it's all unmanned, if there are few lives at risk, does that lower the threshold for action, which gets to the second point of your question about intervention, U.S. intervention, or does it kind of go the other way and maybe make conflict seem less appealing? I don't know. A lot of interesting things to say about that. I think the question of U.S. intervention depends a lot on who is in power at the time. I think the Biden administration has been pretty clear that the U.S. would be involved. I think there are different scenarios in terms of how that would look like. I don't know if it would be a different administration, what the decision would be. The final thing I will say about that is I do think, although the U.S. is obviously the big country consideration when it comes to Taiwan, getting back to the multilateral point, any conceivable U.S. intervention would have to depend very heavily on U.S. allies, especially Japan, and most likely Australia as well. And so I think the kind of their perspectives on it are very important as well in thinking about how a scenario like that would play out.
Thanks everyone for your questions, and thanks for this great comments, Scott. And thanks for the great presentation. And we're going to take a small coffee break of around 7 minutes. We'll get back here at 3 o'clock, and we'll get to a subject that is very much Taiwan related, and that's the global semiconductor industry. So I'll see you at 3 o'clock sharp. Thanks. A panel on a subject that's very much in the news these days. If you follow China's attempts and advancements in the semiconductor industry, and that is this question of whether or not and how and under what circumstances China is advancing in its manufacturing of microchips. But we'll get a broader view of the issue today and the U.S.-China tech war from our own Dr. Yang Jiang and Dr. Douglas Fuller from the Copenhagen Business School. So Yang is, of course, a senior researcher at DIIS that many of you know well. She works on China's contemporary political economy and foreign economic policy, among many other subjects on China's political economy that she's published extensively on. She's also leading a new research project on Chinese and Japanese engagement and cooperation in clean tech industries in different parts of the world. And today she's going to discuss China's response to U.S. pressure on the semiconductor industry. So I'll hand it over to you, Yang.
Yeah. Thanks, Luke, for introduction, and thanks for organizing a joint research project this year on the tech war and competition between China and U.S. And this is part of the results from this joint research project. And there are policy briefs on the wall you may feel free to take. My part is was to focus on what China has been doing, how China has tried to respond to the tech war. I have around 15 minutes. Just want to present some of the facts and history that I have found. So, because I think everyone can't help but speculate who will win the tech war. Is U.S. going to maintain the dominance, or is China going to be able to surpass the U.S. And win the world? And I call it the closing of detours, because it seems that China has taken some detours and so far hasn't achieved its goal of getting close to the technology or surpass technology. And semiconductor or chips are very important and in the center of the tech war. I talk briefly about the current status for China, how China has responded, and what about China's possible choices of retaliation to the West, and how does it imply for global supply chains for Europe. It's very important, global supply chain, but basically design is mainly in the US. I think Douglas will also cover it. Equipment from Japan and Netherlands, and manufacturing in Taiwan, South Korea mainly. So China has relied, for the most advanced chips, China has relied on American design, Dutch and Japanese machinery, and Taiwanese and South Korean manufacturing. But because of US restrictions, it is getting more difficult for China. It is reported that last year China made progress in producing the so-called 7 nanometer process. And it is one of the most advanced, smallest chips. The smallest, the better design or faster processing power they have. It is still behind Taiwan and South Korea. But last month, at the end of August, when Huawei secretly launched or quietly launched a 5G phone with 7 nanometer chips that is all designed and produced in China, it has caused so far a big stir in the tech world, because that is the first one that showed China can make this thing without any US technology. So there's a lot of discussion in the US now also to how to respond it. But there's a question to what extent China can produce this 7 nanometer chip in scale, to what extent it can be used commercially and for its weapon systems. So far, China can produce the less advanced ones for the consumer markets mainly. I'll skip through the US restrictions. I think maybe Douglas will cover, and we can go to that more. And also its pressure on Japan and Netherlands that already started restrictions. But China's first response is that it's not good for China. Some companies felt that there comes doomsday. In effect, then China cannot outsource or use the design from the US and cannot use the ones from Taiwan because they also involve American technology or equipment or design. Then, before the Japanese and Dutch restrictions took effect in July and September, we see a big wave of imports of equipment to China by Chinese companies. That also shows that they're anxious about the restrictions and they want to stockpile equipment so they don't get into big trouble. So for the advanced equipment like artificial intelligence, supercomputers, quantum computing, that is another area that the Biden administration is considering restrictions on. And advanced weapons, China has potential big problems without Western technology. But at the same time, from the highest leadership, they have also been considering for several years that if we have Western technology or Western chips in our security systems, in military systems, that will compromise national security, either by creating a backdoor when the West can hack in, or they can cut off the supply, and then our machines, our weapons won't function. So there have been several years that China has tried to address this problem, achieve sustainability. But earlier this year, and especially in October last year, when the US came up with sweeping restrictions, the domestic response in China was very dark. They felt that, in the words of some leading Chinese scientists in the field, the US has turned off the light tower and China has entered a dark forest. How China has responded partly is to go around and see if they can find other ways to get the advanced chips, and the other is to innovate. The detour part is, for example, they try to go to other markets, Japan, the Netherlands, South Korea, to see if they can be less aggressive as the US. But the gates there are closing, especially with Japan and the Netherlands. And there are some loopholes, like some Chinese companies, they use cloud providers that use advanced American chips so that they outsource the services and the components of the processes. They may rent, they don't buy the chips, or if some Chinese headquarter company is on the entity list and sanctioned by the US, maybe they try to buy through subsidiaries. But the US government has been looking into these loopholes and also closing them one by one. And then there is this interesting question about Taiwan. Some people would think that the reason why China wants to take over Taiwan soon is because to take over the chip manufacturing capability. But the chairman of TSMC company said we can't function without live collaboration with other countries in the U.S., in Japan, in the Netherlands. So even if we're embargoed and China can tell us whatever to do on the security terms, if there is an embargo and cut off the ties with those Western countries, we can't produce those advanced chips. So it doesn't make sense. But we'll see how this will function. There is also discussion within Taiwan to what extent they should move their production to the US, for example, without losing their dominance or and their advantage. Another response is to try to produce it in China themselves. One is to, let's carry on with less advanced chips, but use more of them. Then we can achieve maybe the same result, but more chunkier components. Even foreign companies like NVIDIA has designed lower level chips just for the Chinese market. But the US is also considering to put more restrictions on these just below the threshold chips. And this, the latest 7nm chip from last year, some tech analysts also point out that they're not real most advanced chips because they use some process called multi-patterning, basically to put less advanced together, and they have a higher defect rate than single one module. So there is still a lot of work for China to catch up on. And therefore, it seems the Chinese government has come to the realization that so far the approach was not successful, either by seeking loopholes, a detour around, or just rely on lower level technology. Chinese official, anonymous official told Financial Times in March that he thinks China has wasted too much money to bypass the sanctions. Now we need to put money into the companies. And it seems that is what China has been doing now. So it is quite a different approach that China is taking now, not relying on government money and state labs, but more on selected groups of companies. Then what is potential if we look at within China for catching up? It seems when it comes to manufacturing, maybe China is at least 5 years behind. And when it comes to design, it's even more behind. So it is about 5 to 10 years, a decade. And China has sort of ignored, Chinese scientists point out that they have been advanced in online platforms, cloud technology, but maybe not so much on hardware. That's where it takes time to catch up. And China has tried since 2014 to invest and innovate in semiconductor, in tech, by establishing this big fund in 2014. And there has been 2 big installments in 2014 and 2019, but so far it hasn't succeeded. And the factors could be that there has been cases of corruption. The money went to local governments and set up many small factories without enough innovation. And that's why when the economy is difficult this year, another big rumored money was delayed. And yesterday there is rumor again that China will put a 3rd installment to this big fund. With more money, that's $40 billion, focus on semiconductors. So we'll see how this time it will work with another approach. And China has a more central control, so they don't leave it so much to local governments, but directly central government and companies. So we'll see if that approach is more effective. And paradoxically, now with more sanctions, it could force China to double down on investment, on innovation. So from the government side, from company side, we can see Huawei subsidized by the government to put in more investment in research and development. And it could be that Chinese companies used to prefer to use foreign chips to ensure the stability and quality of their services, and now they have to use Chinese chips. And in this test drive process can help Chinese chips to improve faster. It is one possibility. Taxi companies, Chinese government portals could also be told to use Chinese chips. That could help them to improve too. And see, I think this will be very interesting to see this newer approach of central government and subsidies for a selected group of companies would be a better model than other countries and what China has been doing in the past. And then if we look at what China has achieved in some other newer tech areas like lithium battery and quantum communications, 5G, and space, that is hardware, that it is possible for China to make progress. There is an analyst called Wang Dan. He has said that China has this process advantage. They may not come up with the biggest innovations with Nobel Prize winners, but they are very good at making things in scale and make the process more effective because of big Chinese market, because of the complete supply chains. That's why they can be so competitive in globally. And we have seen solar panels and lithium batteries, and now electric cars. China is occupying the market share. And then once China dominated, then they seek to be more advanced and have the decision power in the sector. So of course the West doesn't want this to happen again with semiconductors and quantum computing, quantum communications. And then we are in the West, of course, we would be concerned about retaliations. China supplies most of the rare earth in the world, not necessarily mining, but processing. 80 to 90% goes to China. It's not advanced technology, and rare earth is not exactly rare, but it is a very polluting, costly process, and it takes time to establish. So when the Chinese government was asked by journalists whether China would consider using rare earth as a weapon in retaliation to U.S. Trade war back in 2019, this National Development Reform Commission, a government economic agency, said Chinese people wouldn't be happy if someone uses products made with Chinese rare earths to suppress Chinese development. So that is a very clear answer. This is one possibility that China would use. I will skip this basically to say that China dominates rare earth. It takes also around 5 to 10 years this time for other countries to establish alternative supply chains. China will not monopolize to the degree as it does, but China will still be able to influence the price, the shape of the supply chain for a long time. China also supplies a lot of metals and other middle products to clean sectors, for example. And China also has the weapon of access to the Chinese market at its disposal. It can target American companies, for example, to seek some deal with Europe, for example. And we have seen that China is becoming impatient with American tech restrictions, especially this year China has come up with a list of prohibited tech export items, crackdowns on US weapons and consultancy firms in China, and banned a new critical infrastructure from buying chips from American company Micron. And then recently the restrictions of 2 metals that are used mainly for cars and green energy. Then what's the scenario, what it means of the tech war for future global supply chains? If China catches up, we will see a competition. Firstly, China will compete with the lower level, with the emerging economies in the production chain. And later, we may see two digital worlds if the trend of rivalry and decoupling continues. As we're seeing maybe also with the underwater, undersea cables these days, that you have a Chinese system, an American system, and Chinese success will have to depend on its domestic market and friendly markets. And China at the same time is also trying to grab the next generation technology, considering how many standards and patents China can seize in, for example, 6G, telecommunications. What's the next after semiconductors, other materials, so that China can have the bottleneck instead of the US to most advanced technologies and economy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Yang. An ominous picture of the future, maybe, but maybe an important point, and Yang knows it well too, that these are particular sectors, important sectors. But the U.S. and China, if I have my numbers right, traded something like $800 billion together in recent years annually. There's $1.18 trillion of U.S. Investment capital, so finance in China, and hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign direct investment from the U.S. in China. So there are a lot of avenues of economic cooperation. But as Yang has unpacked here, there's definitely those of competition as well, and we're going to continue to try to understand those. With Dr. Douglas Fuller, and Douglas is as I mentioned, an associate professor at the Copenhagen Business School, and he's going to unpack the impact of American measures on the Chinese semiconductor industry, and discuss this more widely, this issue. Douglas is still fairly new to the research community here in Denmark, after spending some time in Zhejiang University and the City University of Hong Kong. He's really a wonderful contribution that we have here in Denmark to these questions of China and technology and the semiconductor industry in particular, because he's a leading expert in the field. And he's written a must-read book a few years back called Paper Tigers, Hidden Dragons, Firms and the Political Economy of China's Technological Development. So I encourage you to look that book up as well. So I'll pass the floor to you, Douglas, and you can take us forward.
Is that far enough away? Yeah, okay. All right, so I thought in my copious 15 minutes I would concentrate on a relatively narrow, extremely salient, and very misunderstood sector, which is the semiconductor sector, but more farther away. Okay, thank you. The other wanted it farther away, wanted me to yank a tooth out of my mouth. I wasn't clear with the hand signals there. And particularly, the question of, okay, there are now these multilateral sanctions controls about selling semiconductor manufacturing equipment, or specifically we're going to look at WFE, wafer fabrication, so the core chip making activity, that equipment to China. And what that means. Can China replace that equipment over time with its own equipment? Yang Jiang presented a very sort of maybe optimistic view that China could do that. I want to look at what has happened up till now with some speculation about the future. So, as you probably all know, there were the new heightened, broader controls on October 7th, imposed by the Biden administration. And the salient ones for this space were they had specific general technology controls, more advanced logic, NAND, and DRAM. So the first one are the main chips that do processing and other operations like that. And the latter two are types of memory chips, storage chips. So they basically said equipment that is used to produce these kind of chips, you need a license for. And then there was the U.S. persons control. Many people focused on this as, oh, they want to control American citizens and American permanent residents in China from working with Chinese companies. That is true, but I think the more important idea behind this is American corporations are also U.S. citizens. So earlier, except for Huawei, which had a very special, its own variety of entity list sanctions that we can go into in Q&A if you really want to go down that path. For these other areas, it was very easy to get around these controls. If you're Lam Research or Applied Material, these big U.S. producers of semiconductor capital equipment, of WFE, you just ship it from your operations in Singapore or Malaysia. Suddenly, it's no longer American equipment, given how the regulations were written way back in the day when people had no concept that like design and manufacturing could be separated and everything was integrated in one firm. These were written back in the 1970s. With U.S. persons, you could no longer do that. Lam Research is also a U.S. person. You and nobody who works for you can help such and such Chinese company on these technologies. And finally, as Yang Jiang alluded to, the Dutch and Japanese joined this spring with, of course, this delay period over time. So very briefly, this did not, the two colors are not very vibrant here. Anyway, this is the fabrication process. I'm not going to go into the details. It just goes around and around. You repeat this many, many times. The key areas are deposition, lithography, and etching are the most high technology areas. And in addition to those, there's other equipment that's scattered around this fabrication process, typically referred to as process control equipment. It inspects to see if there's any errors on the wafer you're processing, and then metrology is sort of measurement during the flow. And those are extremely critical for the yield, which is very important if you want to have an efficient production process. So I'm going to go into each one of these areas and talk about what is happening with Chinese firms. So for deposition, here you're just sort of depositing materials onto the wafer. When you create a chip, you're often depositing a layer of new materials on it. And there are 5 firms in China producing these materials. On the surface, that sounds very impressive. Producing deposition equipment, excuse me. In mature chip making sales, they've gone up to about 20% of total equipment sales, but they're really selling relatively trivial equipment, none of the really important equipment, nor can they do any of the really advanced equipment such as ALD, this atomic layer deposition, which is critical for the more advanced chip making. Okay, lithography, this is the area where China is the farthest behind. So if you really want to make advanced chips, you need EUV equipment. Only the Netherlands ASML makes that equipment. ASML and 3 Japanese firms make the second newest generation of equipment, the DUV equipment. But basically, once you get down to 7 nanometers, you really need EUV equipment. And we'll talk about SMIC in a bit, but this multi-patterning, it because it didn't have EUV equipment. So it used DUV equipment. The results are less than ideal. There's this company in Shanghai for a number of years now. People have put out on its behalf these claims that it's about to come out with lithography equipment. This has never been tested in an actual mass production facility. It's in the lab, not in the fab. So it is extremely unproven. There are rumors that they're going to launch at 28 nanometers, so that's a much older generation of technology equipment this year. But it's hard to know much more than that at this juncture. In etching, so before you had depositing, you put a lot of stuff on the wafer. Here you remove the things you don't want. This all sounds, very trivial, but these are actually incredibly complex tasks, especially when you're doing it at these, basically subatomic levels. Here you have Lam Research, Tokyo Electron from Japan, and Applied Materials as the three dominant firms. More importantly, for this kind of equipment, more and more of that equipment has been added for the newer processes. So the smaller the nanometers, the NM, the more advanced the processes. So when we went from 14 to 16 nanometer to 5 nanometer, twice as many of these machines are needed. You need the most advanced machines. Well, again, you have two Chinese competitors, AMEC and Nara, but they're trailing quite far behind. However, if you're making, if you need non-critical equipment and you're a mature foundry, the MNCs are in trouble. Chinese firms are buying Chinese equipment. GTA is a state-owned firm, so they're probably even more likely to buy local equipment. Obviously, the multinationals are upset at this. This isn't about controls, by the way, because this is mature equipment that's not covered by the controls. It's just sort of a reaction to the controls, maybe a retaliation around those. And finally, there's process control equipment. As I said, this is critical for yields. There's a huge incumbent advantage. Probably the dominant player, the dominant player in this is KLA, an American firm. The incumbent advantage basically is because you have all this data you've taken over time from all these fabs around the world. Who has all the data on metrology from the leading TSMC and Samsung and Intel fabs? Well, it's KL. So with that data, they can improve their process further. It's going to be very hard for these Chinese vendors unless they can get sales at the cutting edge to catch up. These days, I think most cutting edge fabs would be kind of reluctant to buy their equipment given geopolitical relations being they are. Here, again, you don't see much progress by Chinese firms. They're doing very simple wafer inspection tasks before there's been any processing, like just the plain wafer. So that's an area where, like lithography, it's going to be a real challenge for Chinese firms. And so when we look at the overall picture, what is going on? Well, Chinese firms have less than 3% of the global market. It's heavily concentrated, obviously, in sales in China. More concerning, I think, is, as Yang Jiang said, well, there could be the idea we'll just grow in China. But China is actually, in part because of the controls, one could argue, shrinking in its relative demand compared to the world. So it was 20 to 25% of world WFE demand in 2022. It's down to 20% in 2023. And even though there were a lot of extra sales because a lot of firms were stockpiling equipment, as she mentioned, ahead of controls. Another big reason is there's all these subsidies elsewhere in the world, right? The history of this industry from 2000 to about 2021 or 2022, Taiwan, Korea, and China were subsidizing this industry heavily. And guess what happened? They gained relative market share. The former established makers who didn't do this, Europe, Japan, and the United States, lost market share in that period. Now you see a situation where the EU, the US, and Japan are like, wait a minute, if we were serious about maintaining this industry at all, in the face of all these foreign subsidies, we have to subsidize. And that's what you see, particularly in Germany, but probably you'll see more activity elsewhere in Europe. And of course, Taiwan and Korea have also doubled down. They're like, wait a minute, now the Japanese and Europeans and Americans are trying to steal this TSMC investment, so we're going to pour even more subsidies in. Now, that might be inefficient, but it's very good for wafer fabrication equipment makers, right? So they see this huge market developing, not in China, but offshore. It looks like a very different situation than we've had for the last 20 years. Finally, what do Chinese buyers think of the WFA equipment in that market? So 70% rank these Chinese providers of this equipment as worse in stability, preciseness, and reliability. I told someone who worked for Lam Research about this finding. She laughed out loud because she was like, well, those are the 3 key factors you need for equipment. So if they're not good at that, it's not very good equipment. 97% think Chinese will do well in non-critical equipment. That makes sense. There is just a large manufacturing base in China. But in the critical equipment, only 3% think the Chinese will do well in the next 3 years. And I have to say, in China, I think there's tends to be more of a positive bias towards China's ability to go forward. So maybe if they asked foreign buyers, they would rank it as even lower than that. So let's go to recent developments or further developments that are happening. Okay, there's lots and lots of misunderstanding around the Huawei phone and SMIC. I think the key problem is the Department of Commerce of the U.S. does not feel obligated to list everyone who's applied for a license and everyone they give a license to. There have been times where they've released data on this when the Wall Street Journal writes a nasty article and they feel offended. But overall, this is an incredibly opaque part of the U.S. government. Almost as opaque as the Department of Defense, which is just a black hole. Money's poured into, and we don't know what we get for it. But in this case, actually, the controls have really not been fully implemented. The Department of Commerce is still approving licenses to sell to SMIC. They're trying to be nice to these American capital equipment firms. I think once this is recognized in Washington, maybe some politicians will start complaining about it. But as it stands, when you look at this, there's one fab in China that can make 14 nanometer and 7 nanometer. It's the same fab made by SMIC. What is the equipment in there? It's equipment from not only the Japanese and Dutch equipment, which they could, until quite recently, still purchase fully legally without a license. There's also a lot of licensed U.S. equipment and U.S. parts that it seems as if the Department of Commerce has decided to, turn a blind eye to some of it. In theory, they've been approving a lot of part sales to companies that happen to be across the street from SMIC, so they could say, well, this isn't SMIC. They've approved equipment that can only be used for this advanced manufacturing to be sold to other SMIC fabs that are doing mature node manufacturing. Obviously, this also doesn't make sense. And I guess it's because the Secretary of Commerce, in her heart of hearts, is actually extremely pro-business. You might not know this or recall, but when she first testified to get her job in Congress, she's like, well, why do we have these controls against Huawei anyway? And then there was a huge uproar, and because she wanted this job for her political ambitions, she controlled her inner pro-business, far right of the Democratic Party vision. But I think now we maybe see that coming out, that so this phone is very much made with American technology. All the triumphalist headlines in the China Daily and stuff are completely and utterly incorrect. Then we have the 28 nanometer. There, again, we don't fully know what's going to happen. But there's reason still to be very skeptical. If you're concerned about efficient production at scale, this is completely unproven. And that's an area where actually Chinese firms can still, this is completely uncontrolled, can still use all this foreign equipment. So they're going to be facing quite a lot of competition in that space. So I'll leave it there.
All right. Thanks very much, Douglas. If I can ask Douglas you to just take a seat there with Yang and Scott too, if you like, for the Q&A. We have around 20 minutes. I think Douglas made an excellent point there too. That points to some cooperation that's still ongoing, even in these contentious sectors like the semiconductor industry between the U.S. And China, and that is through the exemptions that the U.S. government provides American companies to continue trading products that we broadly and in the media here are actually banned. If we think about the recent announcement by the U.S. government on outbound investment, so restricting American companies from investing in countries of concern, those countries of concern being China, they too offer the Treasury Secretary the power to exempt companies from very narrow sectors that are targeted by those outbound investment restrictions. So the headlines we hear are often just part of the story, but the jaws are in a way also closing on both sides, albeit maybe slowly with holes between the teeth. And I think Yang and Douglas's presentations really gave us a great picture of the semiconductor industry. So I'll pass the floor to you now and your questions. We have one right nearby you, Niels, and just please introduce yourself and any affiliation you have. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So Andreas Boy Forsby, I'm a senior researcher here at the Institute. Thank you for some excellent presentations. I have a question first for Douglas. So it's about how important these semiconductors really are. So I remember, I think at the beginning of this year, there was this sensationalistic report published by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute or something like that, ASPI. And it's got this critical technology tracker. And it came out with this finding that China is ahead of other countries, and especially the US, in 37 out of, I think it was 44 critical technologies. And I'm just wondering, I mean, from my perspective, these semiconductors are extremely important in terms of, enabling other critical technologies like supercomputers or artificial intelligence and so on. So how would you rank these critical technologies? Are these semiconductors sort of the basic layer on top of which everything else is sort of built or constructed? So if you are not, at the top of that technology, you can sort of forget being the top dog or the peer of the US when it comes to solar panels. In the end, who cares if China is constructing them cheaply? We all do, because it would be beneficial to the whole world. But I mean, in terms of competition and all that. And so I also, and just one extra question, how far does this competition go? Can you produce those semiconductors below the 1 nanometer threshold? Or is it sort of, could China leapfrog and get into another domain of constructing these processors? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. And Yang, thank you also for your presentation. So I was just wondering, because you had some comment about whether China would blockade Taiwan, because then they would be able to take over TSMC. But I think, wouldn't it, and you gave a very sensible answer that it wouldn't really be optimal, because then TSMC wouldn't be able to get supplies and replenishments from the rest of the world, and then it wouldn't be operational and all that. But wouldn't the nuclear button, so to speak, in this area be that China could sort of, if they have no other options, they could blockade Taiwan, so that no one, especially the West, would be able to benefit from TSMC's production of these very advanced semiconductors. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Maybe we'll just add one more question from the front, gentleman just here.
Thank you. My name is Peter Travis. I think you have established a very good state of affair of the present competitive relationship between the two superpowers. Now, it's no secret any longer that in a year or so, you will have a presidential election in the US. And suppose Donald Trump, which is not impossible, he will have a comeback. How would, in your opinion, that affect the future relation? Will it be still tightening? Will it be critical? or, well, what anticipations do you have? Thank you.
All right. Douglas, did you want to kick us off, and then Yang, and then Scott, if you want to address the presidential election question?
Since you
Thanks.
brought it up, just quickly on the ASPE report, that was heavily based on journal article publications. So I think it was quite skewed. I mean, there's a lot of deindustrialization in the United States, but in aeronautics, for example, I'm pretty sure the US, industry-wise, is still far ahead of China, and yet it showed the reverse of that because it was paper counting. And having worked in a Chinese university, I can tell you, they're big into paper countings. You have an incentive, and then you get the response to that incentive. And there's, I believe it's Caroline Wright, who's done research on this sort of, those incentives sometimes skew, like a Chinese paper versus a paper in Denmark in a scientific journal, maybe not a one-for-one equivalent. And then I'm sorry, it was on to, the semiconductors, how important are they? I mean, I think fundamentally this was driven by national security arguments that these, either directly you have these chips in these weapon systems, or they go into quantum computing or supercomputers or other things that in the future, as Scott alluded to, is the future, AI warfare or robotic warfare that we'll see, or hopefully not see. That these are so critical that they wanted, I mean, Jake Sullivan was very explicit. It used to be, okay, we run these export controls to keep China 2 generations behind. And now, functionally, these controls put kind of a hard stop on China. So beyond the 7 nanometer, I mean, one of the reasons that if Secretary Raimondo is hauled in front of Congress and they're saying, what are you doing? A good defense on her part is like, look, so what? They make these slightly inefficient multi-patterning chips at 7 nanometer. Given the technology they have, and we allowed them to have, they still can't go much further below that. China's always had this E-beam technology that you can use down to 6 nanometer, but it's very inefficient. It's not really at scale manufacturing. And beyond that, you're kind of stuck. You really are reliant on EUV, which actually, surprisingly, has nothing to do with US export controls. The EUV controls were put in the multilateral Wassenaar agreement prior to the invasion of Ukraine. So Russia, now there's not going to be any more agreement in Wassenaar because Russia is part of Wassenaar and they're not going to agree anything. But that was already put into that agreement. So China wasn't going to get that equipment. I mean, the Dutch did sort of make an argument, oh, well, we have a couple pieces we already sold to them. Can we do that, ship it to them? And the response was basically no from the US and some other allies. So I do think in these more advanced areas, they will be quite stuck. You mentioned, I would say though, in the short to medium term, let's say over the next 5 years, if you're thinking of artificial intelligence, there are other options they have to just use a lot more of slightly slower processors. There's a Huawei Ascend processor that's coming out. There was some, in Tom's Hardware, one of these journals that I'm sure you all read because you're fascinated by chips. They made some claims that sounded like it was quite close to the A100, the NVIDIA chip, but other people have told me that's not really the case, that it doesn't have quite the processing power. But the solution is to use a lot more of those chips. There's also software solutions. Is that the ideal situation? No. I think from the point of view, again, of maybe the Department of Defense of the US, they'll be like, well, good, they're spending more money for suboptimal solutions, so they can live with that. But as time goes on, this becomes more and more problematic unless there can be some homegrown solution. I'm kind of skeptical they'll be able to come up with an EUV solution at home, even in the next 10 years.
Yeah, Andreas, thanks for the question on the blockade of Taiwan and its impact on China. It is a response to some people's speculation that China wants to take over Taiwan in order to take Taiwan's technology. So it is just to say that China wouldn't take over Taiwan for that purpose, because it would be also a lot of damages to China's economy. It wouldn't happen unless there is a major, bigger conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And I fully agree with Scott that China wouldn't do that unless Taiwan formally declares independence. China has a lot of domestic economic issues that it needs to prioritize now.
Okay, and so the fun question to get to address, and by the way, invite Young and Douglas to add any views that they may have on this question. I think first of all, I would say that the kind of hawkish stance on China is pretty bipartisan in the U.S. It's pretty widespread across both the Democratic and the Republican Party. The main difference, I would say, on the sort of Republican and conservative end of the political spectrum is there's a bit more kind of willingness to kind of blame China for more things, but the fundamental kind of support for a more hawkish China policy is pretty widespread, and I think that probably isn't going to change, for the foreseeable future. Although, and we can get into this if you're interested, I think what you've started to see just basically in the first half of this year was an attempt on the part of the U.S. to begin to, and it's not really clear, I think, yet whether it's a moderation or a modulation of the economic part of the relationship. So that's where Gina Raimondo's visit, kind of comes in, where Janet Yellen's visit comes in. But regardless, that's not going to turn into anything substantive before the presidential election, because China is such a politicized issue in the U.S. That gets to the substance of your question, or the direct part of your question, and nobody has any clue what a Trump administration would do. However, there's, and I mean, listen, a second Trump administration could look very different from a first, but I will note that Trump sort of had an interesting, the China part of his presidency was actually somewhat interesting. Rhetorically, he sort of dialed it up to 11 on anti-China rhetoric, obviously instituted the trade war when COVID-19 happened, that just sort of blamed it all on China, all those sorts of things. And yet there was a period before the pandemic where he actually sounded some surprisingly kind of accommodating tones toward Xi. And I think there's an interesting strain of Trump that he really kind of sees himself as a negotiator and a deal maker. And I actually think he might be tempted, again, with the caveat that nobody, who knows, like the second, he could be completely consumed by, anything. But I think at least for the first administration, Trump, I think would have been highly tempted to try to make a high profile deal with Xi, particularly to remove the tariffs. And kind of by extension to kind of stabilize the relationship more broadly. So who knows? But I think there was an element perhaps of like maybe he wouldn't go to war with China, but who knows?
Just to follow up on that point, I mean, it's telling that under Biden, the policies sort of continued on, and Congress has done nothing to change it, right? Under Trump, because they were worried about Trump making a deal with China, Congress actually passed a law concerning Huawei and the entity list. They wanted originally to pass a law that said you can't take Huawei off the entity list without congressional approval, for complicated constitutional reasons that violates the U.S. Constitution, because the president has a lot more leeway over international commerce. So they scaled it back that to make that deal, the Secretary of Commerce would have to declare that Huawei is no longer any sort of security threat, sort of banking on the fact that Trump might be reluctant to do that. I don't know why. Trump lies continually about everything. So, I mean, whether Huawei is a threat or not, I mean, it would not be past him to declare it wasn't one. But clearly, and that was a bipartisan bill. So clearly there's this feeling with Trump that you don't know what's going to happen.
Any other questions? One more there. I think we'll make that the final one of the afternoon.
Dwight Robinson, University of Copenhagen. Thank you all for your presentations. They're very thought-provoking. It was interesting how the tech tech competition seems to span all levels of critical technology. So I was wondering if you guys could perhaps zoom into nuclear security specifically, and how communication between the US and China is starting to break down a little bit about how technology is developing on the nuclear level in terms of hypersonic missiles, and that's specifically related to the tech war. How would you cooperate? How would you compete effectively within this domain? And I know also, Scott, at your department, Fiona Cunningham has also written about how China is changing its nuclear posture with regards to this sort of tech development and non-nuclear technology threatening deterrence. Thank you.
I'll offer maybe a thought on that, and then invite Douglas and Young maybe add any concluding observations they might have. I'm definitely not an expert on, sort of China's nuclear strategy or nuclear weapons, whereas Fiona, as you pointed out, very much is. Here's my thing, though. So hypersonics. So first of all, China's nuclear force modernization, that has outsized influence in my experience in terms of how much the U.S. military and the Pentagon, has just like hair on fire alarm about China. They always reference nuclear force posture and specifically hypersonics. I sort of take everybody's word for it that China's the hypersonic glide vehicle test was as concerning as everybody says it is. But one of my things on this is like it's all basically impossible for a layperson to really understand what exactly happened there and what the implications are, because everything's just so highly classified. But I'll take their word for it that it was really concerning. I think broadly speaking, there is not really much near-term prospect for strategic stability talks with China, unfortunately, in the nuclear arena. I do think there should be. The other thing I'll mention is that nuclear security has several meanings, one of which actually specifically pertains to securing radiological material, so not necessarily weapons grade. And that actually is a surprising success story of U.S.-China cooperation. I talk about it in my book, one of the least known and yet most successful. And that really started with, in 2010, President Obama hosted a nuclear security summit. And actually, China's been a great actor in that arena, to the extent that not only has China been very proactive in terms of securing domestic radiological materials, so things like medical waste, or I'm sorry, it's used in like medical MRIs, medical imaging, things like that, radiological materials, but also cooperated with the U.S. to secure similar material in third countries. And so it's actually been a very surprising success story that I think, there probably are some lessons to be drawn from that, although I think one of them is that it's so highly technical and so kind of under the radar that I think, frankly, most people don't know about it. And if they did, it would probably get a lot more criticism.
Yeah, I'm not an expert either, but just some periphery thoughts that, for example, China has collaboration with countries like Saudi Arabia, Central Asian countries, Pakistan on civil nuclear energy, and it is also one way of China's presence and influence. Chinese companies collaborate with some Western companies like French companies in building nuclear power stations too. So there is some degree of collaboration with the West. And when it comes to next generation nuclear energy, it was interesting that actually at DIIS we had a visit of a Danish company that is developing next generation that are supposed to be safer, less costly, but because of geopolitical reasons, they choose to test and produce in South Korea or other places. So these kind of geopolitical competition could also hinder the green agenda as well.
Thanks very much. I'm happy to note that we end the seminar on a somewhat positive note. I'm concerned that Trump might be the reason that we get back to cooperation, considering his foreign policy track record. But we will see, of course, and let's hope, even if that does happen, that cooperation is in our future. So I want to encourage you to pick up a policy brief from one from Yang and one from Douglas about the semiconductor industry, which I at least feel I leave much more knowledgeable about today. And then at your nearest bookstore or online, grab a copy of China's Next Act by Dr. Scott Moore. Such a pleasure to have all three of you here. And we look forward to see you at the next DIIS seminar. So thanks very much, everyone.